Okay, well, thanks so much, Patrick. Can you hear me okay? Can you nod if you can hear me? Thumbs up. Great. Okay. So, yeah, it's a real privilege to be asked to talk at this conference, and rather daunting to be, as a sort of interdisciplinary speaker, the very first setting off. So I apologize if what I say to you is banal or criticizing things that I miss the point, and I'm sure I'll be told if that happens. So what Patrick asked me to do was to look from a sort of philosophical point of view at some of the assumptions made in the standard model of decision making that he just very helpfully lay out on that slide. And when Patrick asked me to do this, a couple of sort of incidents in my own intellectual life came to mind. So one was around about 30 years ago, or even longer. A philosopher called Blair Whitby was giving a talk on the first generation of artificial intelligence. And he said the problem with artificial intelligence, it wasn't really making any progress at that time, is that the people trying to design systems of artificial intelligence were normally men who had grown up with computers from the age of 8 years old. And so from a very early age had learned how to think like a computer in order to program them. And then when they came to model human intelligence, they were modeling their own intelligence, which in turn was modeled on a computer. So they had taken their own very narrow understanding of formal intelligence and hadn't thought beyond. I thought this is a great way of thinking about how oversimple models can have an effect in the longer term. You start with something for the purpose of moving on with a project, and then it can take you over. And you know, in philosophy, many of us read Hume and Locke very early on, and we read this picture of the mind where there are ideas and impressions and force and vivacity, and we think, hang on a second, my mind's not like that really. But you're sort of told, if you don't accept that, we can't go anywhere. So just take this on and see where we go. Right? And then you find 20 years later, you're reading things where people have this revolutionary thought that Hume was wrong. And you knew that in your first week as an undergraduate, but you weren't really allowed to say it. So we let these models take us over. And sometimes they're called sort of pneumatic models of the mind, or hydraulic models of the mind, where you have pistons and cogs and gears, and everything is quite predictable. So I want to talk about two challenges to this, very different types that come out of the philosophical literature. And one is in a book, I can put the name in the chat, by Nomi Arpale, a book called Unprincipled Virtue. I'm just making sure I've got her name right. So what she has done is to think about the models of rational decision making and how rare they are in our ordinary life. So the model of rational decision making we get in the lab, so if you're doing experiments, if you're trying to look at decision time or how people think, you sit someone down in front of a computer, you give them some range of considerations, you tell them to press button A or press button B, and something determinate will happen as a result of them pressing that button. So you know what your decision is. It's relatively costless to make that decision. So the process is just pressing a button, and then there's a clear causal connection with an outcome. The first part of that is you're weighing up considerations, like you're doing a cost-benefit analysis. And sometimes we do this. I mean, once or twice in my life, I really have sat down with a piece of paper and thought, well, here are the plus considerations and here are the minus considerations, and you think hard about that. But even in your head, you almost never do that in the course of ordinary life. And she points out that even in the most momentous decisions we make, she uses examples from literature, but yeah, deciding who to marry or which graduate school to go to, or maybe that one you do more cost-benefit analysis. But many of the most momentous decisions in our lives, we just find ourselves having made a decision. We can reconstruct it afterwards, and maybe we can say there was some tacit reasoning going on, but that seems like a sort of rationalistic reconstruction. If you think about what's important in your life and you try to reconstruct how you got there, very often it just felt right at the time, or it didn't even, there wasn't even a feeling. You just found yourself doing it, right? And this is fascinating. And maybe you are replicating this in the lab now, but the experiments I read about and look at maybe from a decade or two ago are not like that at all. So there's this real question about whether the models we're using to model decision making are anything like what happens in normal decision making for human agents. So the argument is not that that never happens, but the argument is it's something that is very rare and very specialized, but it's taken on as if it's the model because it's easy to study and it's easy to produce. Whereas if you're coming at this from the point of view of biology, actually the real phenomenology of decision making must be fascinating. So what is biologically happening? What's happening in our brains when we find ourselves having done something rather than making the decision? So that's the input stage. And I must say, when I read this work, it felt like, this is what I'd been wanting to read, or even better, write, but I never, of course, had that philosophical imagination or courage. But just to read in such a rich phenomenological way, I suppose part of the continental model of philosophy, the phenomenological model, says how crude and abstract the analytic model is. But here is a work, Unprincipled Virtue, which I think draws us out. The other side I want to talk about, and this maybe is better known, is the lack of connection very often between what we do and the total output. So here I want to particularly talk a little bit about the work of Iris Marion Young, who is one of the philosophers who brought the concept of structural injustice into the contemporary discussion. And now structural injustice is all the rage, both in philosophy and in ordinary life, when we talk about structural racism, for example. And here the thought is that there are bad things that happen in the world that cannot be attributed to a single agent who has caused them. So her example, well, she has a couple of famous examples. I don't have a lot of time, so I've just mentioned one, is about sweatshop labor. So who is responsible for the fact that there are people, often very young people, often young women, working in factories in terrible conditions for almost no money, producing goods that we are wearing ourselves today, right? So who is responsible for their plight? Or you can say, well, it's not me, I just bought the stuff, I didn't make it. And very many people along the line can say, well, that's not my responsibility. Of course, I made a decision to do something. I did buy these trainers rather than those, or but maybe it would have been worse for them if I hadn't. Maybe they would have been unemployed. Always find excuses, but some bad thing happens, which is not the single act of someone. Now, in the case of sweatshop labor, you might say, well, it's obviously the multinationals. There are a small number of them, they can make the difference. But this idea of structural injustice goes back a long way. And I realize now, one of the first papers I ever wrote was about it under a different name. It was a paper giving an exposition of some things in Karl Marx. And I called it Playthings of Alien Forces. And the idea is that very often our lives are structured by forces that are outside our control. So let me give you an example from Capital Volume 1, which I find absolutely fascinating. So Marx is talking about, in the middle of Capital Volume 1, there's a very long discussion about the struggle for a reduced working day. And so at the time he was writing, young children were working in mills under terrible conditions for 80, 90 hours a week even. And so there was a humanitarian campaign to try to get the working day reduced. And a number of major manufacturers got together to write a letter to the government, asking the government to pass a law to restrict the working day. So this was fascinating because these were the big manufacturers. And you think if they wanted the working day reduced, just cut the working day. But their view was they couldn't do that because they would go out of business. If they cut the working day unilaterally and others didn't, then all their profit would be gone. I mean, they were probably wrong about that, but this was a view they had. And they thought that, and there are lots of reasons why they might have written that letter about monopoly power and so on. But one of the things about structural injustice is that it's almost impossible to do anything about it without harming yourself, whoever you are. So we have a lot of very loose talk about structural injustice, as if once you've identified it, we can change it, right? But the fact is, no one really has the agency to change it, or at least ordinary people don't. You don't, probably. So if you think about institutional racism, for example, imagine a racist police force, and you are an anti-racist person who has joined the police, and you go in bright-eyed thinking, I'm going to change the culture. I'm anti-racist. I've written pamphlets, whatever. I've done all this work, and there you are in your first encounter in the canteen. Someone tells a racist joke. What do you do? Now, you could get on your high horse and tell them not to tell racist jokes, but then tomorrow they won't sit with you. When you're on a raid, they won't cover your back and so on. So they will punish you for standing up. So if you keep quiet, that's not really any good either, because you'll be a cold fish. So you have to laugh, right? And you could end up with a police force with no racist individuals in it, because they just all take on these norms and they accept the norms and the culture. So I think a lot of structural injustice happens in this way, that even though people disapprove of it, they would like the world to be different. They realize that if they try to do something, one, it will have high personal cost, and two, it will be ineffective. So do we want to say they've made a decision here? Was there really a decision to be made? So in one sense, of course, they have made a decision, decision to laugh at the racist joke. On the other hand, you might say you have no alternative. And the social and psychological pressure that you would be under in those situations, again, I think is from the point of view.
I won't take up all the time. Lots of
we might have time for a little bit of discussion. I don't know, Patrick, how it's going to work, but I just want to register these 2 points. So I think I called this talk "Decisions?" Outcomes ? And I just wanted to put that standard model under pressure. Now, of course, I'm probably telling you things you already know and you're already thinking about. That's great, but I just wanted to set this up from this sort of slightly outsider's point of view.
Well, thank you. That was really clear and really excellent. I can't find the clap button or the thumbs up button, but it's really fantastic. Thank you, Joe. And we have a bit of time for discussion. And I just want to pick up on the interesting and, of course, very, very problematic example of the racist joke in the canteen. And it seems to me that the person that you're thinking about, who wonders what to do when they hear this terrible racist joke, alternative, they to comply, they can say, we shouldn't be telling racist jokes. And the problem is not so much they don't have an alternative, the problem is that they seem to have rather little agency. So the effect of their saying, please don't tell racist jokes like that, it's not correct, may seem to be very small. It seemed to, as you say, it might have a positive effect on them, and it might not actually produce the non-racist, harmonious world that they want. So what's the difference between feeling that you can't do anything and feeling that you can't make a difference? Do you follow that distinction?
Do follow that distinction, and I think you're right. So there's a sense in which you do have you have alternatives, and there is a decision to be made, and you may well be agonizing. This may actually cut against what I said in the first half, because this may be one of those ones where you do a cost-benefit analysis. Actually, you sit there thinking quite hard about the consequences in this particular case. So it may be these decisions under pressure where we act a bit more like classical decision makers. But the problem is something else, because normally we know what the outcome is going to be when we make a decision, or at least probabilistically. Here we have very little sense. I think, I mean, another way of putting it, so this is not to answer the question, but what I've realized when I talk to some people who are not very sophisticated about decision making, and this comes up in public policy a lot. People act as if we live in a decision theory world, where you make your decision and you can see the decision tree, and you know if you do this, something else is going to happen, and then something else is going to happen. But we live in a game theory world, not a decision theory world, where your decision changes the world around you in ways that you may not be able to predict. Right? And this is why so much public policy goes wrong, because people have thought of themselves as making a decision theory intervention when it's a game theory intervention with multiple equilibria. Right? And here, because it may be, you could be the straw that broke the camel's back in this case, and someone else could say, "Thank goodness someone said that at last." We do get these sort of cascades, norm changes. Yeah.
Yes, and those always make the headlines. That's a very nice contrast between decision theory and a game theory world. There's a nice question from Max, which has come in the Q&A, Max Kuchen, who asks whether lab studies could ever get at this kind of momentous decision like marriage, or and also could get at these diffuse situations where these game theory situations where there are lots of other players.
Yeah, so it's not really for me to say. What I imagine is that you just need a different methodology, because if you've got one person in front of a computer screen, then it seems very unlikely, unless you have some forms of simulation, virtual reality. So it may be you need different methods. I mean, this is always one of the problems that I can remember reading about animal experimenters who were justifying their brutal experiments on chimpanzees by saying they were studying juvenile delinquency in human beings. And I thought, well, if you want to study juvenile delinquency in human beings, if there is such a thing, don't start with chimpanzees in a lab, start with human beings, right? So you need to know, what is your research question and what are your methods, rather than thinking, look at my methods, what can I do with them? So I think, the good research always starts from the question rather than the methods.
Okay, let's have a look. We've got a question from Arsene Kanyawimba and another from Johannes. So let's take, I think we've only got time for one of these, so we'll take Arsene's. So how then can we manage to contextualize experimental design? So let me paraphrase that a little bit. If you study things in real life, they're complex. They're messy. If you want to try and produce scientific accounts, you have to simplify. Is there a sweet spot along that dimension?
Yeah, well, I don't know. I'm not an experimenter, but it seems to me there may be other ways of. It would be really fascinating to know what's going on in the brain when people are making different types of decision, rather than simple decisions. So I suppose if we start with the thought, there are lots of different decision situations. And how can we model a range of different types of decision situations, rather than thinking we know what a decision is and we're going to drill down in as much detail as we can on that? Because I think I've seen simulations with more than one person in the lab, and seeing people making joint decisions and how the brain patterns are completely different if there's another person you're responding to in the lab. So that seems to me a fruitful place.
I think that's coming later in our symposium. So if you stay on the line, I think you'll hear about that. Joe, thank you very much. That was absolutely fantastic. Really wonderful. Thank you very much. And keep the questions coming in the Q&A. We may be able to get back to some of them. And